When Chinese officials speak about partnership and development, however strategic and self-serving, their words carry the resonance of an alternative that Latin American leaders are eager to explore. The irony is profound. The United States, once the architect of hemispheric order, now finds itself on the defensive. Its influence, once unquestioned, must now compete with a rising power that is offering a different model of engagement. And the people of Latin America, long accustomed to outside powers dictating their futures, are beginning to sense that the geopolitical stage is larger than it once seemed. The erosion of U.S. hegemony in Latin America is not just a shift in power, it is a shift in possibility. And once possibility expands, there is no turning back. When we talk about Venezuela today, we must understand that what makes this crisis different from past confrontations in Latin America is the scale and depth of China's strategic investments. For years, Washington's assumption has been that it can isolate Venezuela, cut off its financial lifelines, and wait for its government to collapse under the weight of sanctions. But Beijing has rewritten that script. Instead of collapse, we are witnessing resilience, largely because China has quietly but decisively positioned itself as Venezuela's economic lifeline. This is not random. It is deliberate, calculated, and profoundly transformative. Here is the striking reality. Over the last 2 decades, China has loaned Venezuela more than $60 billion, making it one of Beijing's largest recipients of overseas financing. Much of this money has been tied to oil, a commodity that remains the beating heart of Venezuela's economy. Beijing is not simply handing out aid. It is building a system of mutual dependency. Venezuela gains access to capital, infrastructure, and markets that the U.S. has tried to deny. China, in turn, secures a long-term supply of oil and strengthens its foothold in a region once dominated exclusively by Washington. This is not charity, it is strategic design. And here is the hook. Every investment Beijing makes in Venezuela is not just about Venezuela. It is a message to the world. The message is that nations under U.S. sanctions do not have to collapse. They can turn eastward. They can find new partners. They can survive. This is why China's moves carry such geopolitical weight. It is not about one country's recovery. It is about rewriting the rules of international power. The more Venezuela survives with Chinese support, the weaker Washington's tool of sanctions becomes. Consider the infrastructure projects. Chinese firms have been involved in building railways, housing, and telecommunications in Venezuela. While Washington cuts ties, China lays foundations. These are not just bricks and mortar. They are symbols of permanence. They say to the Venezuelan people, while the West abandons you, we will build with you. Symbols matter in politics. They shape narratives. And the narrative being shaped in Caracas is that Beijing is a partner willing to stay through the storm, while Washington is the power that creates the storm. Think about oil. Venezuela holds the world's largest proven reserves. Yet for years, U.S. sanctions have blocked its oil from reaching global markets. China has stepped into that void, purchasing Venezuelan crude, sometimes indirectly through intermediaries, sometimes directly in defiance of Western restrictions. These oil shipments do more than fuel Chinese industries. They fuel the very survival of the Venezuelan state. It is a quiet but powerful rebuttal to Washington's attempt to suffocate Caracas. For every barrel that makes its way to China, the message is clear. U.S. isolation is no longer absolute. What makes this moment historic is not only the scale of China's involvement, but the confidence behind it. Beijing is not hiding its role. It is openly defending Venezuela's right to sovereignty, framing its investments as part of a broader vision of global cooperation. For China, Venezuela is not just an energy partner. It is a geopolitical showcase. It is a way to demonstrate to other nations under pressure, or Iran, Cuba, even future targets, that alignment with Beijing can provide economic breathing room and political cover. Washington wants to close doors. Beijing is offering to open them. And here's the critical point. China is not acting recklessly. Its investments are backed by long-term strategy, by calculations that stretch decades ahead. Unlike the short election-driven cycles of U.S. foreign policy, Beijing's vision is patient. It is building influence not through bombs and blockades, but through loans, infrastructure, and trade. These tools are quieter, but in many ways more powerful because they create ties that are difficult to undo. A highway built by Chinese engineers, an oil field developed with Chinese financing, or a port designed for Chinese tankers. These are not temporary gestures. They are permanent reminders of who showed up when the West walked away. In the larger picture, what is happening in Venezuela reflects the dawn of a new global logic. Nations are watching. Leaders across Africa, Asia, and Latin America are asking themselves, if sanctions come for us, who will stand with us? The answer increasingly is China. Why? And with every deal signed in Venezuela, with every shipment of oil delivered eastward, Beijing is not only strengthening its own position, it is exposing the limits of U.S. power. That is why China's strategic investments matter. They are more than contracts and pipelines. They are blueprints for a new order. When we think about Venezuela today, we must understand that its importance goes far beyond its borders. This is not simply about a domestic crisis or the collapse of one nation's economy. Venezuela has become a stage upon which the larger drama of global power is being played. The symbolism of Venezuela is profound, because it is no longer just a Latin American issue. It has become a test case for the international order itself. The hook here is clear. Venezuela is not only about who governs in Caracas, but about who governs the rules of the world. The United States has insisted that Latin America remains under its watchful eye. Yet Venezuela, through its alignment with China and Russia, has broken that unwritten rule. It has declared, in effect, that Washington is no longer the sole arbiter of power in the Western Hemisphere. That defiance has made Venezuela more than a country. It has made it a symbol of a new multipolar reality. Consider the timing. At the very moment when U.S. influence is being tested globally, Venezuela is asserting sovereignty in defiance of sanctions and international isolation. For Washington, this is deeply frustrating. It expected Venezuela to collapse, its government to fall, and its resources to become available once again to American corporations. Instead, Caracas is standing with powerful allies at its side. That image alone, of a sanctioned nation refusing to bow, is a message that resonates around the world. If Venezuela can resist, others can too. This is why the Venezuelan crisis is about more than oil, politics, or ideology. It is about narrative. The United States frames Venezuela as a dictatorship clinging to power against the will of its people, a country that needs liberation through external pressure. China and Russia, on the other hand, frame Venezuela as a sovereign nation under siege, punished for daring to chart an independent course. Each side is not just fighting over Venezuela's future. They are fighting over the meaning of international law, legitimacy, and sovereignty in the 21st century. And that fight makes Venezuela a symbol of competing worldviews. Think about the Cold War parallels. In the mid-20th century, nations like Korea, Vietnam, and Cuba became battlegrounds not simply for their own destinies, but for the balance of global power. Today, Venezuela plays a similar role. Its struggle is magnified because it tells the story of whether the U.S. can still enforce its dominance or whether new powers can successfully defy it. When Beijing and Moscow stand with Caracas, they are not just backing a government, they are exposing the fragility of U.S. supremacy. And every time Venezuelan oil flows eastward despite sanctions, the world sees evidence that Washington's grip is slipping. Here is another hook. Venezuela, with the world's largest proven oil reserves, represents the ultimate prize. Whoever secures long-term access to those resources gains not only wealth, but also strategic leverage in shaping the global energy market. Washington knows this, Beijing knows this, and that is why Venezuela's importance is magnified. To lose influence in a country with such immense resources is, For the United States, not only a setback in Latin America, but a symbolic defeat of its broader global leadership. But symbolism cuts both ways. For China, Venezuela is a showcase. It demonstrates that partnerships outside of the Western orbit are possible, that survival under sanctions is achievable, and that U.S. isolation is no longer destiny. For Latin American nations long wary of U.S. intervention, Venezuela becomes a case study in resistance. Leaders across the region are watching closely, not because they necessarily agree with Caracas, but because they see what Venezuela represents, the possibility of options beyond Washington's shadow. And this is the heart of the symbolism. Venezuela has become more than itself. It has become a mirror reflecting the larger transition of the international system. The battle over Venezuela's future is, in truth, a battle over the structure of global power. Will the U.S. remain the sole enforcer of rules in the Western Hemisphere, or will nations like China prove that even in America's so-called backyard, the balance of power is shifting? The answer to that question will reverberate far beyond Caracas. It will define how the world understands sovereignty, influence, and legitimacy in the decades to come. The United States has long relied on sanctions as its weapon of choice in foreign policy. Whenever a government refuses to fall in line with Washington's preferences, the immediate response is economic punishment. Cuba has lived under such measures for over half a century. Iran has faced them for decades. And Venezuela, too, has been subjected to an escalating web of sanctions designed to isolate, weaken, and ultimately collapse its government. But here is the hook. What happens when the world discovers that sanctions no longer work as intended? What happens when another power steps in to blunt their impact? That is exactly what is unfolding in Venezuela, where China's strategy of patience is undermining the effectiveness of Washington's most trusted tool. For decades, sanctions were feared because they worked. The logic was straightforward. Cut a country off from the global financial system, deny it access to markets, cripple its exports, and eventually its economy will collapse. The people will turn against their leaders, and political change will follow. This formula has guided U.S. policymakers for generations, yet the Venezuelan case shows us that the formula is no longer reliable. Despite years of sanctions that have devastated its economy, the government in Caracas remains in power. How? The answer lies in the counterweight provided by China, and to some extent Russia, which have stepped in to give Venezuela enough oxygen to survive. China's approach has been strikingly different from Washington. While the U.S. attempts to break nations quickly through financial strangulation, Beijing plays a longer game. Instead of coercion, it offers partnership. Instead of punishment, it offers loans, trade deals, and quiet but steady economic engagement. This contrast could not be sharper. Washington demands submission, Beijing offers alternatives. The United States has made no secret of its desire for regime change in Venezuela. It has used sanctions, political pressure, and covert support for opposition forces in hopes of toppling the government. Meanwhile, China has poured billions into Venezuela, shielding it from collapse, while Russia has sent advisors, oil technicians, and at times even military support. Each side is digging in. Each side is making it harder for the other to prevail. The more this dynamic hardens, the greater the risk that Venezuela ceases to be a crisis about Venezuelans and becomes instead a proxy conflict for global supremacy. And here is where the danger lies. Once great powers commit their prestige and resources to opposing outcomes, compromise becomes nearly impossible. For Washington, the fall of Venezuela's government would signal the restoration of its dominance in Latin America. For Beijing, it would signal a major defeat of its expanding global influence. Neither side wants to lose. Neither side wants to appear weak. And when pride collides with power, escalation follows. This is not speculation. It is déjà vu. The Cold War taught us that proxy conflicts can erupt suddenly, fueled by local tensions, but magnified by global rivalries. Vietnam was not just about Vietnam. It was about the credibility of American containment. Afghanistan, in the 1980s was not just about Afghanistan. It was about the Soviet Union and the United States testing each other's endurance. Today, Venezuela risks becoming a modern parallel where domestic suffering is overshadowed by global competition. Here is another hook. What begins as sanctions and loans can easily slide into ships and soldiers. Already, the U.S. has increased its naval presence in the Caribbean under the banner of anti-narcotics operations. Already, Russia has deployed military personnel to Venezuela under the guise of technical cooperation. Already, Chinese investment has brought with it a growing political shield for Caracas on the international stage. These steps may appear modest, but in geopolitical rivalries, modest steps often escalate. The more each side invests, the higher the stakes, and the harder it becomes to back down. The tragedy, of course, is that the Venezuelan people are caught in the middle. Their country, once one of the richest in Latin America, has been reduced to a pawn on the chessboard of global politics. Every escalation between Washington, Beijing, and Moscow tightens the vise on ordinary Venezuelans. Their suffering becomes not the reason for resolution, but the backdrop to a larger power struggle. And if Venezuela becomes a proxy conflict, that suffering will only deepen. The broader risk is that a localized crisis could ignite a chain reaction. If Washington and Beijing harden their positions in Venezuela, it could spill over into other contested regions. Latin America could once again become polarized between blocs, as during the Cold War. 4. Global diplomacy could fracture further, making cooperation on climate, trade, or security nearly impossible. The stakes are not just Venezuelan, they are global, and this is why the risk of escalation must not be underestimated. Proxy conflicts are not relics of the past. They are living dangers of the present. Venezuela, with its oil reserves, its symbolic defiance, and its powerful backers, has all the ingredients to become the next stage in a rivalry that is already reshaping the world. The question is whether leaders in Washington, Beijing, and Moscow will recognize the danger, or whether they will stumble into yet another conflict that history will remember as both avoidable and tragic. When we speak of Venezuela today, we are not just speaking of a nation in turmoil. We are speaking of the redefinition of the global order. For much of the last century, international politics operated under a unipolar reality. The United States stood alone at the top, dictating terms, setting rules, and enforcing compliance. But Venezuela exposes a striking truth. The rules are no longer unquestioned, the authority no longer absolute, and the order itself no longer unipolar. What is unfolding before our eyes is the transition toward a multipolar world, and Venezuela has become one of the clearest markers of this transformation. The hook here is powerful. Venezuela is not just a country under sanctions. It is a case study in what happens when a superpower discovers that its word no longer defines destiny. For decades, Washington's decisions were treated as binding not just in Latin America, but across the globe. If the U.S. cut off access to financial markets, collapse was expected. If the U.S. declared a government illegitimate, isolation was inevitable. But Venezuela's survival, propped up by Chinese investment, Russian support, and alternative trade routes, reveals that America's reach has limits. The message to the world is simple. The old order is breaking, and a new one is emerging in its place. This is about more than oil, sanctions, or political rhetoric. It is about the fundamental architecture of international relations. A unipolar system functions on dominance, where one power dictates and others comply. A multipolar system functions on balance, where several powers counter, challenge, and negotiate. Venezuela stands at the intersection of these two models. Washington wants to enforce dominance. Beijing and Moscow want to assert balance. And the result is not just a tug of war over Caracas, it is the exposure of the world's new reality. Think about how this shift changes the psychology of smaller nations. For decades, countries facing U.S. pressure had limited choices, comply with Washington's demands, or face crippling isolation. Today, they see a different horizon. They see Venezuela sanctioned and isolated by the West, yet still surviving with Chinese oil purchases, Russian technical support, and international allies willing to resist U.S. dictates. This changes the calculation. It tells nations, you do not need to bend. You can resist, you can negotiate, you can look elsewhere for lifelines. That change in psychology is as important as the change in economics, because it empowers leaders to imagine futures beyond American hegemony. Here is another hook. When a single power loses the ability to impose its will, the world begins to ask who sets the rules now. Venezuela is part of that question. Is sovereignty defined by Washington's approval, or by the ability of nations to choose their partners freely? Is legitimacy determined by Western capitals, or by the collective acceptance of a multipolar community? These are not abstract debates. They are practical, immediate, and deeply consequential. They are reshaping the principles on which global diplomacy operates. And this is why Venezuela's crisis is not an isolated event. It is a signal. The struggle over Caracas is not simply about regime change. It is about whether the 21st century will be defined by unilateral dominance or cooperative balance. Washington may still cling to the language of control, but Beijing is speaking the language of alternatives, Moscow the language of defiance, and other nations the language of independence. This clash of narratives is not temporary. It is the new foundation of global politics. The irony is profound. By trying to tighten its grip on Venezuela, Washington has revealed the weakness of its grasp. Every sanction that fails, every warning that goes unheeded, every oil shipment that sails eastward despite U.S. pressure becomes evidence that the old order is crumbling. And every Chinese loan, every Russian advisor, every diplomatic defense becomes evidence that a new order is taking its place. So when we look at Venezuela, we are not just witnessing a Latin American crisis. We are witnessing the reshaping of world power. The global order is being redefined not in conference rooms or treaties, but in the survival of nations once thought doomed by U.S. disfavor. And the lesson is unmistakable. The 21st century will not belong to one power, but to many. Venezuela has exposed this truth, and the world can no longer ignore it.